Well, we're joined now by Michael Ratney, who is former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Ratney, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to Arabiya English. The United States and Saudi Arabia have this 8-decade-long diplomatic relationship. What's your interpretation of what the state of that relationship is right now?
So thanks for having me on this morning. I think the relationship is in pretty good shape. Over those 8 decades, there's certainly been some ups and downs. In the course of the Biden administration, it went down and then it got much, much better. During the Trump administration, I think in substance, it's quite good. And also, it seems like President Trump and the Saudi Crown Prince have a remarkably warm rapport. And I think that's probably what we'll see on display in Washington today.
Right, yeah, I was going to ask you about the relationship between the two men. And as you said, it's an extremely strong relationship. In an article penned in the New York Times, you wrote that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made advances once thought unimaginable. And I'd like to ask you, since you served in Riyadh until the start of the year, what are the main changes that you've observed in Saudi Arabia during the past decade?
The changes are sort of in 2 categories. Economic, there's a huge economic diversification effort going on, and also societal. And I think for somebody that visited Saudi Arabia 5, 10, 15 years ago, and then again in this recent period, that's the most dramatic change that you see. It's the most palpable thing. Saudi was famous for women being marginalized in society, for example. And now you go and Saudi women are everywhere. They're in the workforce in large numbers. They can drive. They can basically control their lives in ways that they never could before. So I think that's the most obvious thing when you step off a plane and visit the country. But there's a lot of other things as well. Saudi was never a country where you had an arts and culture scene, for example. And now there's movie cinemas and concerts and art exhibitions in a way that were once not only unheard of, but actually illegal in the country.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really striking when you look at the demographics of Saudi Arabia that 70% of the population is under the age of 35. And here we're talking about the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's just turned 40. I mean, do you attribute much of the change in Saudi Arabia to him personally and the fact that he is a leader really quite close in age to his population?
Yeah, absolutely. He marks the generational shift in the leadership, although he's obviously not king yet. I think he eventually will be. All of the other kings of Saudi Arabia have been sons of the founder of Saudi Arabia, and this will be the first grandson of the founder, the first generational shift. And I think part of that, he understands the demographic that he represents. Saudi's a fairly young country, and they have the ambitions of young people. They want to be normal. They want recreation. They want jobs. They want all of those things. And I think he understands that in a really kind of palpable sense.
And Ambassador, President Trump has clearly pulled out all the stops for this visit and rolled out the red carpet. What's your interpretation of what he and the American administration wants out of this visit?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because a lot of what we've read is what Saudi Arabia wants from the United States. But obviously, President Trump has some expectations, too. I think he'll talk about normalization, the prospect of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, although I don't think that's in the cards right now. I think it's something that President Trump has ambitions for. I think the president has ambitions for large investments from Saudi and elsewhere in the Gulf into the United States. I think some of the numbers I've heard have been enormous in the billions and billions of dollars, and I think he'd like to announce that. And he'd like to announce commercial deals, the prospect of U.S. defense sales to Saudi Arabia, for example. He just mentioned yesterday that the F-35 would be something that would be offered to Saudi Arabia. So I think for him, there's a personal component to it, but also I think he sees this in starkly commercial terms. He sees this as kind of economic opportunity for the United States.
And prior to serving in Riyadh, I gather you were the U.S. chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Israel. And I'm wondering how much discussion you expect President Trump and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to have about the Israel-Palestinian issue.
Oh, I don't think it'll be a part of the public discussion, but I think privately, I'm sure they'll talk about it. I'm sure the Saudis, like others in the region, are relieved that, at least for now, we're in a period of ceasefire. And there's a prospect, the UN Security Council resolution passed yesterday authorizing a security force. So there's some forward momentum. And I think for the Saudis, that's all for the good. The Saudis are looking to de-escalate the conflicts in the region so that they can focus on what they're doing internally. And I think that will be part of the discussion with President Trump. I also think the president, as I mentioned, will talk about the prospect of Saudi's relationship with Israel at some point. I think until we're in a better place with respect to Gaza, I don't think the Saudis are going to consider that. But I think in the long term, it still remains a possibility.
And what message do you think Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman brings to Washington in this regard?
I think, their message publicly for a while, and I think that'll be reiterated today, is to really get past where we are in Gaza at this point. The Saudis, and I think other Arabs as well, they want to see the Israeli Defense Forces out of Gaza completely. Right now, they're occupying half of the Strip and still essentially control life there. I think they want to see an end to Israeli military involvement in Gaza. And then politically, they want to see a path forward, at least towards the prospect of a Palestinian state. And that would require an Israeli government commitment in that direction. And at this point, the Israelis haven't been willing to talk about either thing, either a complete withdrawal from Gaza at this point or the prospect of a Palestinian state. And I think the Crown Prince is going to make that clear to the president, that those are the requirements that they've had publicly, and they're reflective of the sentiment in his country and the sentiment throughout the region.
And how much do you think that red line and this insistence on a Palestinian state, to what extent do you think that will shape President Trump's approach to this issue?
I think he knows it. He understands it. I think he'll push. I think in a way it may give him greater incentive to push Netanyahu further on these issues. I think it was through Trump's pressure on Netanyahu that got us to a ceasefire and a hostage release. It got us as far as we've come now in the past couple of weeks. And I think President Trump will see in rather clear terms what's going to be required if they want to move ahead to this prize that he's so anxious for.
And clearly these last 12 months have been 12 months of enormous change in the region from which I'm speaking to you. And one of the things that I think a lot of people found was a real watershed moment for the Gulf in particular was the Israeli strike on Doha in September. And I'm wondering how much of a game changer you think that strike was. What do you think came out of that?
So I think it was a shock to the region, certainly to the Qataris, but also to everyone else in the Gulf, the Emiratis, the Saudis. I think every country of the GCC was shocked to see that happen. And I think it reinforced, in a sense, among some countries, certain doubts about the United States as a reliable security partner. And on the one hand, I think those doubts became clearer. On the other hand, the reaction was not to sort of withdraw from their desire for a stronger security relationship with us. I think what they want is greater clarity in that security relationship with us. I think that's going to be a big part of the discussions today with the Saudis. I think they recognize that their long-term security prospects are best with a strong U.S.-Saudi partnership. I think they're just going to want absolute clarity in that. That's why the Saudis have been pushing for something more than just a defense agreement. They've wanted a mutual defense treaty, something that in our system would require ratification by the U.S. Senate. I don't think that's possible right now, but I think they're going to use this opportunity to press Trump for the strongest possible commitments to Saudi defense.
Now, during the years 2015 to 2017, you served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria. Now, that's another country that's had undergone enormous change the last 12 months. And it seems to be very much on the radar of both the US and the Saudi leadership. And I'm wondering why you think Syria is such a focus for those two countries.
So I think for Saudi, it's clear. Saudi Arabia regarded the war in Syria that went on for at least 12 or 13 years is just a losing proposition, right? It was bad for the Syrians. It was bad for the region because it stoked radicalization. It brought, Iranian influence into the region. It triggered population flows. It was all bad. And I think the Saudi approach at this point is just whether or not these conflicts are resolvable is an open question. What they'd like to do is just de-escalate them, eliminate to the extent they can the pernicious effects of these conflicts. And Syria was the best example of that. Even before Assad fell, I think the Saudi objective had just been to de-escalate the conflict and return to some sort of an uncomfortable status quo. with Assad gone, it created a new opportunity. It created risks, obviously, because the gentleman that took over in Syria is somebody with a difficult past. He comes from a jihadi background. There were grave doubts about the direction he would take the country. But I think they saw positive signals from what he was saying and what he was doing. And I think from the Saudi perspective, that's worth taking a chance on. It's better than the alternative, because for them, the alternative is basically chaos. So they took a chance with him. They want to invest in him. They urged President Trump to do the same, and that means opening up the economy, dropping the huge web of sanctions that the U.S. and other countries have put in place, and basically, rather than ostracizing the Ahmadinejad, to at least try to embrace him and move him in the right direction. So I think that's where the Saudis were coming from, and I think that was impressed upon President Trump when he visited Riyadh a few months ago. I don't know whether President Trump came into that with any great preconceptions about Syria. If anything, I think he just wanted nothing to do with it. But I think between his conversations with the Saudi crown prince and probably with the Turkish president as well, he came to the same view, which is engage, let the economy breathe, give this guy a chance.
Okay, and just lastly, I just want to ask you, having served as US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, for any anecdotes, any memories that strike you about the degree to which the country has changed in the last few years? I know you left in January of this year. I expect you've been going to Saudi Arabia for many years. What was most striking about the Saudi Arabia you left behind you in January of this year versus the Saudi Arabia you knew perhaps a decade or so ago?
You know, the biggest change is the one I mentioned a moment ago. They're just the role of women in society. I would sit with Saudi women who were describing to me their experiences, and you would swear they're telling you about the stories about how their mother or their grandmother used to live years and years ago. But that's not the case. These are Saudi women, often in their late 20s, telling you about their experiences in their early 20s. And now you see them embracing these economic opportunities, taking a role in society, being every bit as hardworking and ambitious as anybody in that country. And it's really remarkable. And it actually has nothing to do with how they dress. That's sort of the most superficial thing that people in the United States tend to focus on. It's their role. It's what they're doing. It's where they're working. It's the jobs that they're taking. It's such a palpable change.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, you know, you say that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been very much a part of that, partly by virtue of the fact he's of the same generation as the majority of the Saudi population. Just lastly, what's the photo opportunity, the big moment that you think perhaps will immortalize this visit in terms of photography?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's going to be the Crown Prince and President Trump with very big smiles on their face when they're announcing something. And I don't know whether it's going to be in the area of artificial intelligence or defense or energy or any of the things that they're doing. I think that sort of personal rapport that the two of them have will come through loud and clear.
Okay, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Michael Ratney, former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks for the invitation.